Louis Ray with Dr. Mark Walters. The purpose of the interview is for the Chemung County Historical Society's Oral History Project. Today's date is August 6, 1989. Our location is the Garden of the Washington Square Apartments in New York City. Dr. Walters, when did your family first come to New York City?
My immediate family was born here, both my parents born in Brooklyn. My grandparents arrived back in from Trinidad, one grandfather from Barbados and another from Jamaica by way of Panama.
What brought them here?
Well, I never found that out exactly, but I'm certain. But I'm certain that it was job opportunities. But I never asked them pointedly why they came here.
What kind of work did they do?
One grandfather was a chef, and his biggest position was head chef for the staff at Bellevue. And the other grandfather, the one from Barbados, was a carpenter, and he worked in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn during and after World War II.
Did both of your ancestors find employment easily in New York City, or did they first come seeking one trade and then end up doing something else and having had a number of skills which they were able to utilize?
From one grandfather, the one from Jamaica who worked as a chef, I know that he did work as a cook in many different locations for many different employers over the years before finally working at Bellevue. And he has indicated when he had to move on because establishments closed down and there were some problems. As for the other grandfather, I never spoke with him about work. And with regard to my grandmothers, who I didn't mention, I think that they did part-time work about work. And with regard to my grandmothers, who I didn't mention, I think that they did part-time work or they worked for relatively short periods of time during any stretch of time. So I don't think that it was a problem.
A little bit about yourself and about your educational achievements.
I was born in Brooklyn, 1952. I went to private school, Catholic school, public school on the way up, or high school, and I went to Cornell and City College for college, Princeton for graduate school, MIT as a postdoc. I'm a chemist by training, and I work now at New York University. I'm a faculty member in the chemistry department.
Dr. Walters, I'm very interested about the time you spent in Tompkins County, which is very near Chemung County, as a young adult coming from New York City. And I would like to know, as a young black male, what some of your experiences were.
That's going to require a bit of recollection on my part. I arrived at Cornell in 1970. That was a year after the Straight takeover, and the takeover was in fact a major impetus for me going to Cornell. I was looking forward to being among some of the leaders in social and political change in the United States, on the campuses and off campus. What I found was not an environment of political ferment as much as an environment where there was a social ferment occurring. and saw a large influx of black students to white campuses across the nation. And much of the change, many of the changes that took place within the black communities on the campuses themselves. In addition, many of the changes that took place within the black communities on the campuses themselves, in addition to interactions between black students and white students, or the lack thereof, and interactions between black students and white professors. So it's really difficult to sum the whole thing up, but I think if I attempt to do that, I can be most successful in talking about the lifestyle. We all were cognizant of our political forebears, the recent ones, namely Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We were aware of the activities of the Panthers, SNCC, CORE, of the civil rights movement, and at least in statements that people made, the tendency was to hold the ideals and ideology of Malcolm X and the ideology of the Panthers in high regard, with almost no, there seemed to be very few adherents to the ideals of Martin Luther King, at least not openly. That wasn't fashionable. It wasn't radical. It wasn't radical enough. And it would seem that the actions among black students did not, for the most part, follow the stated, which we seem to hold. We were, by and large, middle class, and we had middle class aspirations, and our social interactions reflected that. Our consumer habits reflected, our study habits reflected that, and the type of things that people went on to do, which I probably shouldn't or won't try to speak on now, seems to have borne my initial feelings out. There were relatively few interactions between black students and white students, at least openly. I know in my dormitory, the interactions that I had were in part hostile, and in part any white friends who I would feel free just sitting at the table chatting with, or in the lounge chatting with for an extended period of time, friends who I knew in anything other than name. Of course, that wasn't true for other. I knew them quite well. So there really was a separation there. With regard to white professors, I didn't understand them, and I don't think they understood me, and I wouldn't be able to say very much in detail about my interactions with the white professors at all. In fact, if there were some who tried to help me, I wouldn't have known it, and if there were some who were intentionally trying to harm me, I wouldn't have very much evidence for that, because the interactions weren't deep enough, and I'd say that was largely my fault. The burden of observation lies with the individual who's living their own life. It's incumbent upon me to be aware of my environment, and in choosing to cut myself off from the Caucasian members of society, I was not taking in the data that was otherwise available and would have been valuable. And I think that there were a number of other black students who did the same thing. There was hostility. The decision to arm the campus police took place after the straight takeover. So if there was any indication that there was a major problem, that was it. But I don't think I have very much other detailed information on that.
I found that quite interesting and quite fascinating. Could you tell me something about how you as a student differentiated between social ferment and political ferment, and perhaps from then give us one or two examples?
Social ferment is easiest to talk about because how we interacted among ourselves. If I just talk about the males, we were trying to decide what was permissible behavior and what was not permissible in terms of the type of activities that we did, in terms of the way we dressed, in terms of what type of music we liked to listen to, and who our friends were. Our political persuasions were supposedly important, although I think that was in word only, not in deed. And there were daily decisions being made in the black community about how black males and black females. And I think that even at the tender ages of 18 to 22, we recognized many of the problems in black male-female relationships. I mean, they were just becoming apparent, or just beginning to harden at that time. But I think that for most of us, we just adhered to traditional values, even though we were aware of problems, and even though we discussed problems among ourselves to some extent, perhaps because of immaturity, or perhaps more importantly, because I don't mean to blame students for everything, perhaps because of a lack of guidance from role models, older faculty members or members of the black community, of interaction with them. We really didn't have very much to go on. We didn't have the benefit of discussions with people who knew more than ourselves about what growing up was like. So within the black community, within the black community, the social ferment was perhaps just a reflection of our bewilderment and our furtive attempts to design a world according to should be. I don't think that we succeeded in changing very much, however, because that's a major task, and we were also at the task of getting an education, and also at the task of growing up, getting to know ourselves as individuals better. So we tried, but I don't think that we got very far. As far as the political firm is concerned, that's more subtle, because there were organizations on campus that I think really structured themselves around social models. For example, I'll name Ujima, which was the dormitory, the black dormitory, which was set up while I was there. And the idea was socio-political. So I don't remember there being a political manifesto per se that was let's say at least strongly expressed in setting up that dormitory. But the idea was that if we interacted among ourselves and lived in a cohesive environment, that we would be able to protect our interests better. We would be able to be more productive, and perhaps that's true. Perhaps that's true. There were students who were black Muslims on campus. There may have been some students who had been affiliates of the Panther Party, but the most obvious group of students were those who were black Muslims, and the thing that they seemed to have in mind in conducting their day-to-day affairs had to do with social issues and religious values. And once again, there didn't seem to be a manifesto that they actually expressed. They adhered to one, but I don't think that there was any attempt on their part to proselytize, no serious attempt. And the strongest political presence on the campus, but it was a presence which mostly served for cohesiveness among people who were followers of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Thank you very much for sharing that with me and with us who will be listening to this interview. It seemed as if you had a very interesting and historically significant time and experience as a student. What do you, looking from today's perspective and looking at your experience both at Cornell and City College, what do you feel today from the perspective of civil rights has been most important about your experience?
Well, the most important thing that the idea that I turn over in my head on almost a daily basis, or if not daily, frequent basis, is the idea that integration, which was a focus of the civil rights movement, and equality, but integration is what I'll address here, has perhaps caused some positive changes to take place in the society, but perhaps because we haven't been as vigilant among ourselves as we could have been, just to take place as well. And the reason for the positive changes is that we've gained access to housing, jobs, educational opportunities. But the reasons for the negative influences is because out ourselves to lose, to a large extent, our cohesiveness as a community. And I tend to see that on the campuses today, where if and this was true when I was a student as well. If black students don't know you as well, if black students don't know you, if you're not a member of one of the classes, that is one of the enrolled classes at the university, you are essentially any desire on their part to draw you in or to seek you out for discussion, for conversation, unless there's something that you can do for them as for me as a faculty member or as an administrator. So I see that among students. I see it less among black administrators, less among black faculty members, because the environment currently is one which is hostile toward black people. Perhaps let's just say that that's just an outcome of institutional racism, so that there's no need for me to point fingers at individuals who very well know who they might be anyway. But I think that in a general sense, institutions, if we just look at the communities, I seem to see, as many commentators on the social and political scene have said, it's been years now that they've been saying this, that there has been a weakening in the black church. There has not been a strengthening of black community organizations for the most part. There does not seem to be a strengthening of black social interaction. It seems that we have all taken our into consumerism, heightened consumerism and jobs very much to heart, and we're tending to a greater degree to go our own way. And I think that's been a negative outcome of the civil rights movement. It has allowed excess of individuality to take place, and it's ironic because that was not the intention of the movement or of its leaders. But I think that when doors were opened, we all rushed into separate doors and closed them behind us, and didn't try to ensure that there'd be other people coming along with us, and that we still had somewhere where we could coalesce and commune. So those, to the extent that they still exist, are good ones. Namely, that we do have members of black and Hispanic groups who are employed at very high levels of responsibility. That, of course, precludes being CEOs, and we're well aware of that. That precludes being President of the United States and even Vice President. We can see what type of person they prefer to have as Vice President. They prefer to have an incompetent white man rather than a competent black man as a Vice President. So we can see how things stand. But I don't think that we should have allowed ourselves to dissipate our community strength over the past decade and a half in the way that we have. And I think that that's partly an outgrowth of the civil rights movement.
Thank you. Dr. Walters, where do you think the civil rights movement is headed?
To the extent that there is a civil rights movement, I think that it's going through a period of observation and introspection. And I say that an unemployment situation, a drug situation, and a situation in the courts, and perhaps even the legislature, which is entirely inimical to our viability as a black people. And that type of problem can be solved for the most part by the activities of black people among themselves, first and foremost. Setting up a program to ensure that we don't disappear as a viable economic or political or social force in the country, and it hinges less on appealing to the government and its agencies for ensuring our employment and ensuring health care, etc. Drugs, as we all know, exacerbates the problems that we have beyond almost all comprehension. What we face there is the loss of a cadre. These are the young men and women who, in other times, would have formed the phalanx in the civil rights movement, and without them, we don't have the troops. So it's not possible, really, for us to contemplate a civil rights movement existing in the face of a drug where it's dangerous for young people who are involved with drugs as well as for those who are not involved with drugs. Unemployment is perhaps one of the roots of the drug problem, and unemployment or underemployment is a problem for all citizens in the United States, but it falls most heavily, as we know, we can just see the statistics, it falls most heavily on black people. And it's not clear what is to be done about that. Clear is that the old formula that we had, where we said access to jobs, we demanded access to jobs, is not enough, because we certainly do have access to minimum wage jobs, and that's actually a program of genocide if it's allowed to continue. So I really think that for the common person, for the person who is not a leader, as well as for those among us who are leaders, we're engaging in dialogue. I think that has to be dialogue and analysis. I think that has to be done. And I think it's really hard to say right now what's next, what the next step is. But self-sufficiency have not explored at all to its fullest extent. In fact, I think that we have forgotten about that. And self-sufficiency means that when you have masonry which needs to be fixed, you can find somebody who's going to fix it for you and will do it right away and will not be charging you exorbitant prices. Self-sufficiency means that if you need health care and you don't have the money for it, you're not going to be treated like you're a criminal simply because you can't afford the most expensive hospitals or the most expensive or exclusive private attention. So we have people who are capable of rendering such services, and I think that rendering such services need to be forthcoming with those services. We essentially have to take a cut and pay, is what you're talking about when we're rendering services for people who cannot afford to pay what we would otherwise ask, and that's really what we would otherwise ask, and that's really where the self-sufficiency issue comes in. So that's my overview of the issue.
Enlightening and thoroughly enjoyable interview. This is the conclusion of a practice interview with Dr. Mark Walters and Louis Ray for the Chemung County Historical Society's Oral History Project.